Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video we are going to be reading through and translating stanzas 12 to 23 of Hrafnsmál, also known as Haraldskvæði. And a quick refresher for those of you who haven't seen the previous video, which will be linked in the description if you want to have me reading through stanzas 1 to 11 with you, is Hrafnsmál is a poem consisting of a raven having a conversation with a Valkyrie, where the raven tells about the great exploits of the mythical Norwegian king Harald Finehair. And at this point I need to explain the emojis that I've chosen for this video. So in the poem itself, in the manuscripts, we don't have divisions or any kind of indicator that the narrator is speaking or the raven is speaking or the Valkyrie is speaking, but we can tell from the context of the lines. But to make it clear, I've added in these little emojis so we can see who is saying which lines. So this figure of the person speaking is when the poetic narrator is speaking, this angel is when the Valkyrie is speaking, and this eagle is when the raven is speaking, because I couldn't find an actual raven in the Unicode emoji selection. So to recap very quickly what happened in stanzas 1 to 11, the raven just tells of how King Harald Finehair grew up with a very stoic, firm childhood, and he rejected comforts, and then he fought a marvelous battle and won, and we're now getting the aftermath of that battle described. So we're still in the middle of a long section where the raven speaks to the Valkyrie. And a quick note on pronunciation in this video. As I did in the previous video, I'm going to be pronouncing this neither with modern Icelandic pronunciation nor with the reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation, which is 13th century Icelandic pronunciation. Instead, I'm going to be trying my best to pronounce it as it would have been pronounced in the 9th century. So I'll probably still make some mistakes because I am trained in pronouncing it with 13th century Icelandic pronunciation, so that's my standard for Old Norse, but I may still make some mistakes, so forgive me if I slip up there and it's a little bit inconsistent, but I wanted to give you guys a sense of how an Old Norse poem from the literal Viking era would have sounded like, because I think it's quite fun, especially given that on this channel, we also cover a lot of Old English poetry, some of which would have been composed and performed at around the same time, so it's nice to hear and contrast how the two different but contemporary Germanic languages are doing their poetry around the same time. As usual, if you want to pause the video and have a go at reading the Old Norse on your own before I give you my translation and commentary, feel free to do that, and without further ado, let's get on with it. So, Waller lathar a sandi wittin enum ein eige frigjar fathum bygvi, fagnudum dod slikri. Annat skulu þar eiga amba til Ragnhildar, dísið dramblatar at drikkjumalum, an seið hergápur, es Haraldar hafi sweltar valdverja, en verðar þeirra brati. Hafnar í homryggjum og horða megjum, verði enni heinvert skú og kolgatar, kongrðin kynstorði, es tók konnuin dansku. Whereso is feia val þeim is volverja, ítrogn flyttar við oithratamenn sína. Mjokkarðir rýfðir brogvirtingar, þersi Haralds tunni húnum verpa. Þeir göður kvogrum makkum malmi hunlenskum og manni á strönnu. Alright, so what does all of this mean? Walalathar Asandi. The slain lay there upon the sand. Now, Walar here is technically a single, but it just means the slaughtered in a general sense, in the same way as in the very first line of this poem, the poetic narrator addresses the audience as Hludi Hringberender, meaning may all the ring bearers listen, but clearly, that's not an individual ring bearer who he's referring to, but it's rather referring to all of the ring bearers gathered in the hall. And bear in mind the ring bearer audience, because it's going to be relevant in the stanzas that we're about to look at. So the slaughtered man lay there upon the sand. Witin enum ein eige friðar fagnbyrði. So witin means an omen, and as you might note, we have two nominative singular nouns in this sentence, walar and witin. And when we have two nominative nouns in a sentence, and we don't have a connecting word like at, which joins the two, this implies in these ancient texts that the two are equivalent to each other. So it's not that the slaughtered lay on the sand and there was an omen to Frigga, to the one-eyed embracer. It's that the slaughtered lay on the sand as an omen to this Einegja Fallenbugvi. So the one-eyed, deep embracer Fallenbugvi, Frigga of Freya. So this is clearly a reference to Odin here. And I think, by the way, this enum is, well, actually, that's just to make it more sophisticated. It's the one-eyed, deep embracer. And we've got reference, I believe, in the poem Hrafnsmál, which are, of course, the sayings of Odin, and Jackson Crawford has done a full video on that if you want to know what that says on his YouTube channel. And in Hrafnsmál, we learn how Odin sacrifices his eye to gain wisdom, and from what I've heard, this trope of Odin sacrificing his eye to gain wisdom isn't attested elsewhere in Norse poetry, but here we definitely have a reference to Odin being one-eyed, although we don't know necessarily why he only has one eye. And he's described as the deep embracer of Frigga, which is obviously some sort of reference to, like, marital embraces and such like this. So then, Fagnudum dod slikri. We rejoice, because of course this is the Valkyrie the raven referring to him and all the other ravens. We rejoiced at such a death, dod slikri. Anat skulu thar eiga ambat til Ragnhildar. So the serving women of Ragnhild, who's the woman who would go on to become King Harald's wife, and as I said, I think in the previous video, there was a legend that Queen Ragnhild earlier in life rejected a marriage proposal from King Harald Finehair because he wasn't yet king of all Norway, and so he didn't cut his hair until he became king of all Norway, and then he kept his hair in a very pristine condition. So we've got this, I'm not going to say divorced dad energy, because like a divorced dad who becomes successful, but it's like, you know, the underdog finally gets the girl and he's very proud of himself. So now he's like doing this whole I'll show them moment, you know? And that's what the poem is doing for him. So the serving women of Ragnhild, Skulu Egad, they should own Anat, something else. Disi Dramblad, the haughty women. Now this word Disi can mean goddess, but it almost certainly doesn't have a supernatural implication here. These are obviously human women. They're just at the core. And not only are they human women, but they're not even human women who the poem is holding in very high regard, as we'll see later, because they're called like war lynxes, which arguably is a somewhat derogatory term going on here. So the haughty women should have something else, at drikkjumodum, in their drinking conversations. Now, this reference to the drinking conversations is pretty interesting for a lot of reasons, and I should probably at some point do a whole video essay on the wine talk, the drinking talk that you get in ancient Germanic poetry. But we see, for instance, and I've done a video on this one, I believe, with Beowulf and Hunferd's speech, where Hunferd gets up and criticizes Beowulf in chapter 8, I believe, of that poem, and then Beowulf calls him out and he's like, you're full of it, blah, blah, blah. And one of the justifications he gives is that he says that Hunferd is drunk on the beer and therefore isn't speaking fully truth. So that there's definitely this implication, which we also see, by the way, in Atla Kvadi, I think, which is an epic Old Norse poem about the slaying of King Attila by Gudrun, I believe, or Gunnar. So she at one point is accused of, making bold threats because she is drunk on wine. And there's obviously an implication then that when people are having their drinking conversations, they make boasts that they can't actually uphold, and that's being referred to here. So there's a whole thing with words and works in ancient Germanic poetry where it's okay to give your boast, like in the video I did on Beowulf. in his toxic masculinity, I talked about how it's sort of okay in that poem that Beowulf boasts about himself and gives a speech talking about his own deeds because he actually did the deeds, and then he goes on to prove himself in battle against Grendel. And that's sort of the whole point of those chapters surrounding Beowulf's speech, is that, Beowulf is saying that he's going to cleanse Heorot and kill Grendel, but he hasn't yet done it. And therefore there's some tension in the Geats who are there in Heorot because they don't know whether or not he's going to be true to his words yet. And so there's this idea that you can have the words without the works. And we can see in these women, the servants of Ragnhild, that their husbands are implied to not have necessarily done the works, and that reflects therefore on the women as well. So the women have made these boasts. Ragnhild's serving women have made boasts about, whether it's boasts like putting down King Harald or just talking up how great their own husbands are. And they made these boasts while they were drinking in the hall and under the influence of alcohol. But then when it came to the actual battle, their husbands, who are the ones who are like doing the works on their behalf, haven't actually come through. And these lines, like I said, it's the I told you so moment, or it's the I'll show them moment. So King Harold, through the, the medium of this poet, is being like, you talked the talk, but you didn't walk the walk, to Ragnhild's serving women. So the poet says, or rather the raven says, that these serving women should have something else during their drinking discussions. An ertheid hergaupa, because you wore lynx's sea. Now this is a really interesting line, and the academic sources that I've consulted before reading this poem to you guys have noted that these next two lines are really difficult in terms of the Norse grammar to parse. I think I've got an explanation that roughly works, but, I could still be wrong on this. I'm not an Old Norse expert per se. But I'm taking these to mean you wore lynx's sea, saith hergaup, which is pretty interesting. And I strongly suspect that these war lynxes are referring themselves to the serving women of Ragnhild, the haughty noble women. So what this sort of means is that if we go back to the picture there, like this is obviously an early modern depiction of it, it's not a medieval one, but this painting only depicts a raven speaking to a Valkyrie, but there's clearly also a poetic narrator in terms of figures who are in this poem. And there are also, I think, two other figures who are to some extent engaged in this conversation. So we've got the poet who is addressing the audience, and that audience addresses the ring bearers, which will be relevant in a couple of stanzas. So we have the poetic narrator, the Valkyrie, the raven, and we also have, I think, a moment where the raven, if you imagine this guy turning his head to address the war lynxes, the serving girls of Ragnhild. And I think part of the reason this is because this poem is envisioned as being told probably in King Harold's court, right? Because the Ragnhild serving girls are present for the raven to turn and address them. So this is literally a Norse poem breaking the fourth wall. And you've got a character within the poem who looks at the audience, or at least part of the audience, in real life and says, you guys in real life, you, the viewers watching this at home, or like, obviously not at home, but you people in the mead hall during your drink conversations, because I think it's interesting also that it comes right after that. Like, they should have something else during their drinking conversations, because this would have been told in the mead hall while they're drinking and having these conversations. So it's a pretty interesting fourth wall break there, I think, at least as how I'm interpreting these lines. Because, war lynx is plural, and then we've got the plural for the serving girls of Ragnhild, so that's what I think is going on. So what did they all see? So you war lynxes see Es harder haviswell valdrejar en werda theira bradi. So I'm reading this S as that. You wanting to see that Harold has the slaughtered blood, the blood of the slain, and then sweltad is of the slain. N I'm reading as while. While werda theira. The men, and then Thera is of them. So I think this is referring back to the Dicia Dramblata. Now, this is the reason it's a bit confusing, right? Because in these 1, 2, 3, 4 words, the raven suddenly turns to address the Warlingses in the audience, presumably in the audience in the hall. But then it seems like he goes back to talking about them in the third person. So the way I like to imagine this is, they're at the hall. And I think, by the way, these early verses, like I said before, are happening possibly within a mead hall. And the Valkyrie is maybe a guest at the mead hall speaking to the raven. And the raven is mostly talking to her. For those 4 words, the raven turns its head and breaks the 4th wall and talks to the serving women of Ragnhild, and then turns right back to the Valkyrie and carries on talking about it. So I just think that's really fun. But there we go. So he's saying that you Warlingses see that Harold has the blood of the slain. Maybe it's implying that he's drinking it in some kind of glorious ceremony, because I do think that there is a sort of metaphorical binary between, or rather, a metaphorical understanding of human bodies as vessels filled with blood in the same way that cups are vessels filled with alcoholic beverages. And this perhaps corresponds to the words-works distinction, right? Where words are the tools by which cups are filled with mead in the hall, and martial works of war are the tools by which human bodies are, either retain their vital liquids or have that poured out of them through literal bloodshed. So I'm working on that as a thought in my head, and I'll probably do a video on it at some point. But anyway, so what this entire sentence means is the servant girls of Ragnhild will have to have something else, some other topic of conversation during their drinking discussions. Because you Warlingses see that Harold has the blood of the slain while your husbands are feasting. While their husbands are feasting. So I think this reference to Hergaupur, the Warlingses, is almost certainly pretty derogatory. This is an I told you so moment, it's I'll show them moment. And we see that, for instance, in the Old English poem Exodus. Pharaoh's army is referred to as a bunch of war wolves who have gathered around him. So it's a pretty derogatory term. I think it's not a positive one. But obviously they're still accepted in the society, at least somewhat. They're present at the feast. And, their husbands are feasting while Harold was out doing the hard work, basically. So it goes on to say, now that King Harold has shown everyone, Havna the Holmbryggjum, he rejected the girls from Holmbrygger and the Hordameum. Now the Hordameum refers probably to Hordaland, which is in western Norway. And he also rejected Hweri Enni, every single one, Heinwerthku og Holgaata, from the lineage of Heinwerska, which is Heinmark, a place in east central Norway. So he rejected everyone from Heinwerk and Holga, another place in Norway. Konungur Enkin, the mighty king, was the one who rejected them. Es tok konu enedonsku, he who took a Danish wife, and this Danish wife, of course, being Queen Ragnhild. So that's the end of the Raven's speech. He's gone on and told of the great battle that King Harold engaged in, and then how he showed everyone who had never doubted him. So then Valkyrie asks, Whereso es fejaval? How generous is he? Them es folwerja. To those who protect his land, itra ogenflytte, the glorious terror flyer, basically. Now, this isn't, the ogen here is not meant in a negative sense. This is one of those aspects of early medieval Germanic poetry which is hard necessarily to communicate, is that when they say something like he terrorized this group of people, they're not necessarily framing that as a negative thing. Although, as I will talk about in future videos on Beowulf, there are certainly moments of self-awareness, and there are critical voices within these poems, Hunferth as a character being one of them, to voice those critical thoughts. But even the poetic narrator in Beowulf reflects on some of the trauma and the brutalities brought about by warfare and by violence at the hands of kings, but for the most part, saying that a king terrified people, inflicted violence upon them, this is framed as a good thing, not a bad thing. So the terror flyer, basically, how generous is he with Ithro Tarmentina towards his skillful men? And then the raven responds, Mjok eru reivdir rogbyrtingar. So the strife showers are very well enriched, basically. There's I Haraldskvæði hun warpa. They who, because this is a contraction for their s, which is the older form of their air. So they who, I Haraldskvæði, in Harold's enclosure, hun warpa, they throw dices. And of course, throwing dice is the generic indoor pastime, which is referred to in most medieval sources. Even though they had board games like Nefertafel for the Norse, they seem not to evoke that as the standard, like just the generic image of people enjoying domestic leisure. It tends to be throwing dice, and this is consistent both in Old English, Old Norse, and even contemporary Latin literature. So it's a pretty stereotypical metaphor to evoke there, or motif, I should say, to evoke there. So, fei eru þeir gydir. They are endowed with wealth, og fogrum macum, and with fair swords, malmi hunlenskum, with Hunnish metal, which I think is pretty interesting. And I have I'm trying to figure out personally, in my personal reading, the relationship between Huns, giants, and the Romans in Old English and Old Norse and early Germanic literature in general, and it's quite possible, even probable, that there are some degrees of commonality in how these tropes are evoked between all of the surviving literature that we have, and there are also possibly some distinctions. A sort of rough thought I'm getting is that the Huns are posited as almost dragon-like figures in the ancient Germanic poetry who come to besit or to possess this giantish metal, and these giant material cultures are, I think, implied to be Roman. If you look at Eotna Iwerk or Eotna work in Old English poetry, this almost always seems to refer to Roman material culture, as in the Old English poem The Ruin, which I have done a full video reading through on my channel if you want to learn more about that, where in that poem the ruins of the Roman baths in the modern-day English town of Bath are referred to as the creations of giants. So I think that there's this image set up in the ancient Germanic poetry that the Romans, who are, sometimes described through the metaphor of giants, these great Roman giants of the past created this glorious material culture. And the Huns are like these dragons who came in and hoarded it and possessed it. And sometimes they can distribute bits of it to people in certain circumstances for the purpose of corruption. And I'm drawing a comparison here to the dragon in Beowulf, who, of course, sits upon giantish, it's literally described as the treasures of ancient peoples, and some of this is described as, Eotanisk, like giantish in its construction. So this dragon possesses and hoards this giant material culture, and some of it is able to slip out to people who inevitably bring corruption and destruction to the characters in the story. And if you go back to my video on Hildebrand's Lead, in a part of that poem, when the father, I think, Hardubrand, is trying to avoid the battle and offer some kind of surety to his son Hildebrand, he removes from his arm a very prestigious ring, which was Keisuringugatan, which is it's hard to translate, but seems to mean something like made in the Roman Empire. So Imosole Kuninga, which the king gave to him, Huneotruchten, the lord of the Huns. So I think that there is a echo in there of the king of the Huns almost functioning like a dragon in the sense who he possesses these armbands which were made in the Roman Empire and therefore are extremely powerful and valuable. And he's given one of those to Hadibrand. And so Hadibrand, in that particular story of Hildebrand's seed, is taking on the less manly, less virile role, right? Because he's an older man, he's less physically capable, and also it's his son, he doesn't want to kill him on the other side of the battlefield. So he tries to avoid the conflict with words and with a gift which violates the words works distinction, because words and gifts are the means by which one resolves disputes within the mead hall. But Hildebrandt and Hildebrand are meeting not in the mead hall but on the battlefield. They're outside the domestic sphere where they have to use works to resolve their dispute. And that's why in the poem itself, if you go back and watch my video, Hildebrand responds to Hildebrandt, or the son responds to the father, saying, Mit geru skal man geba in fachan. A man should obtain a gift with his spear, ort with arorta, point against point. And I think there's a pun in there on the difference between the word for word, which is word, and the word for spear point, which is ord, or even for leader. Because, you know, the father is trying to use words to avoid a conflict which, according to the social conventions of early medieval Germanic literature, have to be resolved by the spear point with the ord. And that's where the pun resides and revolves around in that poem. And so that was a very long tangent to give an example of like Hunnish metal being maybe the symbol of this, or this thing which can be given. I shouldn't say Hunnish metal, because this reference here to Hunnish metal, it could perhaps be meaning something that was given by the Huns to, or which came by means of the Huns into King Harold's possession, or it could have just meant something much more abstract and remote to the Old Norse people who were listening to this poem. They might have just had some vague idea that the Huns were a powerful people who became very wealthy and took a lot of stuff. That's also quite possible. I really need to do a proper video, and I will try to at some point, elaborating on this Huns as dragons concept that I'm forming in my mind about medieval Germanic poetry. I'm very sorry to have gone on such a long tangent, but I do think it's worth leaving in because it might be interesting. Anyway, so Harold's men were enriched with money and with fair swords, Hunnish metal, and money austranu with an Eastern slave woman. So this Eastern slave woman might refer to slaves from the Rus, from elsewhere. It's hard to say, but yeah. So moving on to stanzas 19, and I will go through and read the Norse for you. Tha þeir reifir as we to romu wanni, orwir uppar hlaupák, arar that sveigja, homlur that slittar en hoi at brjóta. Ríkla hygta waru þeir sad vísraði. At skaldar reiðu will spyrja alls þykkis skilvita, greppa ferðir þú mund gorra kunna þeirðes við harli havask. Gerðum þeirra og góðvágum at í kun leikum við konung, veldum raða ráðum makvel fagrendúðum, sverðum silfröptum, serkjum ringofnum, gildmann veltum og grafnum hjálfum, ringmum handvarum as þeim harðlir valdi. Right, so what does all of this mean? Then there are the foxes, as we to Romu Wani, who knew the expectation of slaughter. I do think it's an interesting one that they are referring to the foxes here. Maybe it's because they've already made references to the war lynxes, and the war lynxes are being referred to in kind of a derogatory sense, because I think this word gaupr can also refer to a fox. So, foxes aren't wolves. They're not as, I don't think they're treated with as much respect in Old Norse poetry. And of course, there is an admittedly much later, I think 13th or 14th century, Icelandic poem called Skálfhalabolkur, and I've already done a video reading through the first 4 stanzas of that on my channel, and there will be videos covering the rest of that poem, which describes in ancient poetic style the exploits of a fox who may be a sort of Icelandic iteration of something from the Reynard the Fox literary universe from the Middle Ages, but that story doesn't frame the fox in a super heroic manner, right? The fox is a thief, he's a bit not the most courageous person. And so I think it's interesting that they're talking about the foxes here, who are Eswitu Romuvani, who knew the expectation of slaughter, basically, or expectations of slaughter or death. So I wonder if this is referring to cowardly men, like a metaphor for cowardly men, rather than literal foxes, because the beasts of battle, who are typically described in this literature as feasting on the bodies of the slain, are ravens, eagles, and wolves, and ravens and eagles are related to each other. And wolves are symbolically important as an animal because in Old Norse and Old English literature, they're kind of also used as metaphors for humans. So I think when we have references to wolves, they are more likely sort of metaphors for plunder and such, whereas the eagles and the ravens are maybe more metaphors for whether something Odinic in the case of ravens, or perhaps even just the fame that comes about from a battle because these birds can fly about and be seen for miles. So they can also fly like rumors fly. And so we see, as I mentioned earlier in the Old English Exodus poem, Pharaoh's army described as Walwolfus, but generally what you get is a distinction between wolves and wargs, where wolves are more neutral as an animal, but wargs are very bad, basically. And for instance, there is I think, 14th century Swedish law code, which I have analysed a bit of as part of my PhD research, which punishes gårdavargar, they sort of slaughter wolves who have killed more of a herd of livestock than is allowed by the law codes. So wargs can be a metaphor for criminal humans as well as for like evil lupine animals, right? And likewise, wolves can be animals, can be warriors, but a more positive term, basically, are wolves and wargs. And likewise, I think foxes are less complimentary of a term than wolves, so this might refer to perhaps the people who aren't participating in the battle but want to come in like a fox afterwards to steal the plunder and run away to their lairs. So there are the foxes who knew the expectation of slaughter. Orawir up at Hlaupa. So they are the ones who knew Orawir up at Hlaupa. So this is an accusative infinitive construction where it's saying they knew that the arrows would leap up. Ok arar at Swega. And they knew that the oars would bend, so bending into the water. Homlur at Slita. That the restraints would be broken, and high at Brjóta, and that necks would be broken. I'm not fully sure, honestly, what these restraints being broken and necks being broken is probably a reference to killing, but I don't know what the what restraints are being referred to here. It could maybe be something to do with like the barnlocker in Old English are the things which your ligaments which bind bones together. So that might be what it's a reference to, like limbs being cut off. So this next sentence is a bit hard to pass, but it's Rigla hik tha waru theisa atuvisa rari. So hook is I reckon, atuvisa, or I intend. Atuvisa is to show, and because it has the at here, there's more of an implication that it's a purposeful thing. These ones with the arts are all accused of infinitive constructions, and so the art is probably included for metrical purposes more than much else. But in this case, because we have the hic here, we can assume that the artuisa is more purposeful. So I intend to show, Ravi, with my speech, with my counsel, fa waru thesa, that then the oars rushed on, or the rowings rushed on, ricula, richly or powerfully. So I intend to show, by talking about all of these things, that the rowers in Harold's fleet rushed on very powerfully. And this is, of course, referring to the Ithrotalmentina, the very skilled fighters who accompany King Harold. So I think the raven is in some way justifying what is happening. So he's just talked about how Harold is very generous to his warriors, because the Valkyrie asks the raven how generous is he to his warriors. And then the raven talks about all of the things that Harold has given them, and then he justifies this by saying, the foxes expect plunder and arrows to fly and people necks to be broken, etc. And I'm intending to show you through this that these men row very vigorously. They're very eager to go to battle. It's another thing that, the vigorous rowing is meant to indicate, right? These men are eager to get to the battle. So then the Valkyrie responds, At skaldari the Vilixpiria. Vilixpiria is, I wish to ask about the raiment of the poets, at skaldari thu. Als thikisk skill wita. Thikisk is yusim, wita, to know, skill als, the difference of all, the distinction of all. And so I think, by the way, this is maybe the poet who I believe is suspected to be Thorbjorn Hornklovi on the basis of stylistic analyses. I wonder if this is Thorge Horborn. I can't remember these names. Thorbjorn Hornklovi. I wonder if this is Thorbjorn being like, including a line about the poets just to make sure that he's tipped very well, let's say, by King Harold Finehair for writing this very complimentary poem about him. Because, like, the Valkyrie, who select people for Valhalla, they want to know that you're paying your poets very well, King Harold. So, pay up. So, I want to ask about the raiment of the Skalds, because you seem to know everything. Grappa ferde rumund gorlakuna. You must know the troop of poets very clearly. Thereves med harli havask. They who are housed with King Harold. I do find it interesting also that you have Grappa ferde, you have these like troops of poets. So there's a lot of different reasons why this could be, in my opinion. It could be that King Harold is fostering a lot of different styles, and poets are known for different things. And /or, these different poets are meant to go out into the world and tell people in lots of different places about King Harold Finehair, to spread poems like this one. So then the raven responds, Agerdum ser thera. So one sees Agerdum thera in their, I believe that's deeds, or in their gear. Ok a golbaugum, and in their golden rings. At eru in kunle cum with konung, that they are in a relationship with the king. Bear this in mind also, the golbaugum, because as we said earlier, the very first stanza addresses the ringbearers, the ones who are bearing these rings. Now, I don't think this is addressing poets necessarily themselves, but the raven is saying that the fact that they bear the rings indicates that they're in some kind of relationship with the king, like a social relationship with the king. And that's one of the reasons I think that the reference to the ring bearers earlier on in this poem is a reference to this poem being performed at King Harold Finehair's court itself. So I see in their rings and their gold, I see in their gear and their gold rings that they're in a relationship with the king. Feldum rather raudum. So they command, or maybe they occupy the red fields och vel fagrendudum, and the red and well painted shields. Swerdum silverworthum. They also command or besit the silver weaved swords. Sercium ringovnum. This is the chainmail corselets. Giltum anfeltum, the gilded sword hilts. Och gromnum hjolmum, and the engraved helmets, because as you guys may know from some of the archaeological finds at Sutton Hoo and various other digs in Scandinavia, that we do have finds of very richly engraved helmets and these things. And there's been a lot of debate archaeologically as to whether these were actually used in battle or not. Many people think that they weren't. There's to some degree a plausible explanation for why they might be used, and this might be to sort of big up the image of the king who is wearing it, and / or potentially as a means of supplementing for a king's actual performance, right? So if in all of this poetry, the king, the victorious kings, are described as possessing like these gilded swords and embroidered scabbards and engraved helmets, then seeing a king who wears that stuff, even if that king hasn't necessarily engaged that much in battle, that might reinforce in the retainers who are serving the king that this king is capable of martial deeds, which the king himself has not yet demonstrated. So that's some thoughts on the correlation between this stuff and the material culture records that we have. Ringum hand parum, the hand-borne rings. This could be a reference to armbands as well, like the one that, as I mentioned earlier, Hardibrand took off his arm to give to his son. So, Estheim Haraldskvæði, these things which Harold, now Valdi sort of means ruled, but in this case it means distributed fame to them. So the poets are equipped with all sorts of nice things. It's pretty interesting also actually that the poets are also given military gear, right? This idea of like a warrior poet. And it would make some degree of sense also that poets would need to be present in the battlefield in order to do it. And there's another explanation for this also, which is that if these are the very fancy material culture given to poets, because bear in mind that these aren't necessarily the things which were given to the warriors. So Harold's warriors were given Hunnish metal, beautiful swords, and a slave woman, but they weren't given the stuff that's pretty like this, like the golden sword hilts, the engraved helmets, the silver swords. So perhaps also this serves to distinguish poets on the battlefield, and perhaps there was some kind of understood code among the warriors in this ancient Germanic society that the poets aren't necessarily there to serve a military function, they're there to serve an aesthetic function, so they aren't necessarily to be harmed in battle. That could have been the case, and I'm just purely speculating here, but it could have been the case. So moving on to the final lines, having the raven has now told the Valkyrie about all of the poets, so the Valkyrie wants to ask about other groups of people. So I will read these lines to you. At berserkjarveiðu vil ik spyrja, bergir rassawar, hversu fengið þeim í folk waðar wigðjar from verðum. Úfhernar heita, þeir orðum blóðgarðandir berða. Wigrar vjóða til wigs koma, þeim sist saman, araðis monum einum hygg þar undir fellisk skilli sain í skilvísi, þeim skjál hogwa. At leikurum og trúðum hef kviklít frekt, hverðis orgat í þeirra andraðar húsum Haralds. At hundi elskar vandrar og heimsku dryggjar einar lásum og jóvar hleggir, Hinnir verðu og aðrir of eldskul brinnanda spon bera. Logunum húfum havask und linda dreppet haldrappir halir. Okay, so what does all of this mean? So here we see a construction very similar to what she asked in the previous clauses. Vilexperia. I wish to ask at berserkeriðu about the raiment of the berserkers. Which, by the way, is, I'm just very excited that I get to do a video looking at actual Viking poetry, talking about actual Viking berserkers on my channel. It's very fun. The Bergir Rassawar, the tasters of the Hra's corpse and then Sawaras of the sea. So it's like the tasters of the corpse sea, or maybe the blood sea, which I think is very, very cool. Wheresu es fenget thames I folkwater. So this is a complicated bit of syntax, but let's break it down. So wheresu is how, es fenget, basically it goes down, how it goes down, how it's received. Thames wig djorfenwerem. So for those or to those battle brave men, and then the S contraction here is a relative clause tacked onto the end of the themes. So for those battle brave men who folk whether who wander into the folk or into the people. So this is a reference to them invading the people. And it's possible, because this doesn't necessarily specify that it's an enemy folk or somebody else. There have been some interpretations of berserkers that they were like almost like a secret police of the Viking kings, like a very violent group of thugs who just went around doing what they want. So this reference to them invading the folk could be a reference to King Harold's own Norwegian people, and saying that these guys, a very subtle dig at these berserkers for attacking the people themselves. But again, that's speculation on my part. The Raven goes on to say, Ulfhead narheta. They are called wolf heads, which again, so cool. We do have in Old English a cognate word, wolfsherfod, although that actually refers to an outlaw. So again, there could be some degree of stigmatization of these berserkers going on, or criticizing them for some of their violent activities, even though they're very clearly kept within the fold of the king's retinue here. So they are called wolves' heads, theirs I orrostum blodgarrandir bera, they who carry bera blodgaranda bloody shields I orrostum in their armors. This contradicts, by the way, the stereotypical cultural image we have today of berserkers being naked. And also, I think it doesn't necessarily contradict the etymology of the word berserker, right? Because the berserkers could have started off as a group of warriors who fought naked, and then that meaning fell away because one of the proposed etymologies for berserker is that it's like bare-shirted in the sense of empty shirted. There is another interpretation that it means bear as in B-E-A-R shirted, like an ursine shirted warrior, although I think, given that the Old Norse word for it is bjorn, I think that probably linguistically that's less likely to be the case because you'd have the I there, but I'm nowhere near knowledgeable enough about sound changes in Old Norse and Early Germanic to tell you whether ber as an adjective is more likely the origin in berserker than bjorn. So if anyone watching does have a good sense of which of those two it's more likely to be, please let me know. But anyway, the point is that clearly these berserkers in Hrafnsmál are not naked, they're wearing armors, and they carry bloody shields. Wigrar Rioda, which is the valiant men shouted, as till weeks comma, who come to battle. Thames dar the sist summon, those who work together. Ara this monomenum hic. So, and then I'm trying to think of which way is best to go about this one. So, I reckon that each of the, for one ruler, thar under felisk skilly. So he hid himself under a cover, sa en skillweisi, that accomplished man. I think it's referring to King Harold here, or maybe to a berserker even. And then it might be that this ar that is monum einum is referring to the theme back here. So I reckon that the skillful man hid himself, felisk, under skilly, under a cover, against that one ruler who, thems I skjold hogwa, who hewed against his shield. That's possible as a reading of this. So this could be referring to a battle between, whether this skill we see is referring to King Harold Finehair or maybe to an individual berserker, saying that he protected himself well against his opponent who hewed against the bloody shield. And given that the berserkers just earlier are referred to as carrying bloody shields, I reckon it's probably a reference to the berserker who is the skill we see, the skillful man, rather than King Harold. So the berserker defended himself well against those people who hewed at their shields. So then the Valkyrie goes on to ask, at leikurdum och trudum hevik lit freget. So I have asked you little, at leikurdum och trudum, about the players and the jugglers. Whereas orgati theirra andadarat husum Haralds. So, whereas orgati, what is the hospitality theirra andadar of the deceased man and his followers at husum Haralds among the house of King Harold? So I'll be candid, I've looked around. I can't see reference to andadar as an Old Norse god. It's clearly, it means like defeated or deceased. Andadar, I just don't know what this is a reference to. It's clearly something to do with a Norse deity of jokes, of hall revelry, but I can't find any other reference to it, unfortunately. So the raven then responds for the final stanza here. At hundi en elskar andadar, ein lausum. So andadar elskar, now in this case it would literally mean loves, but I think it probably means something more like shows affection. At hundi lausum, with his earless dog, och heimsku drugir, and he pretends to be the fool. Och jovertlugir, and the chieftain laughs. Hinnir eru och adrir, so they were here and before. As of eld skulu brinnanda spon berra, they who have to, of eld from the fire, berða brinnanda spon, they had to carry a burning coal, basically, or a burning ember. So what it looks like is that Andadar maybe is the leader of a retinue of jesters, and he goes around playing with his earless dog, who maybe does some tricks, and meanwhile there are jesters who were going in front of Andadar and behind him, or maybe on both sides of him, who had to carry like burning embers from the fire. So maybe this is the true that we have going on here. So sorry, the leikurum here. So then maybe they like juggle these burning coals, and that's where the humor comes from. It's a bit of slapstick humor, and the chieftain laughs at the humor of these guys burning their hands while juggling burning embers from the fire. I think it's a bit cruel, but then again, this is literally Viking poetry about a Viking king, so it makes sense that he might enjoy such gory entertainment. So, logondum huvum havask. So, they have been had, or they have been, yeah, maybe killed by Loganumhoven, by burning hoods, und Linda drepet haldrapir halir. So they have been killed, or the Hallworthy heroes have been killed by burning hoods, und Linda, and I think this means like the wounds of spears. So the wounds of spears maybe have killed these men with burning hooves. And also the word Linda here. So lind is often, it refers to the wood of the linden tree. So it doesn't necessarily refer to a spear. It can also refer to just the tree, and the reason it refers to spears is because that's a wood that they're commonly made of. So it could mean that this is a sort of ironic inversion of the trope, right? So the typical trope is that men are killed by linds, so they're killed by shields and spears on the battlefield. But these jesters, with their burning hoods, maybe they were carrying stuff in their hair, or maybe it's a reference to them having red hair, I don't know. But they're killed by the wounds of the same wood because they are maybe burned in the fire, or they have an accident during their performance or something like this. So yeah, I think that's what's going on here. And also the haldrap here is like heel worthy. So it sort of implies that these these quote unquote warriors, the heroes, the halir, are kicked about a bit for slapstick entertainment, and that's why they are slain. And but one last thing also to bear in mind is that drepit doesn't necessarily mean killed. It can mean slay or to cut. So it could mean the heel-worthy men have struck a wound of lindens with burning hoods. These last lines are a bit difficult to pass, but for sure it's part of the whole revelry that's going on in the court of King Harold, presumably with a troop of jesters led by this guy called Andadar, deceased. And as you can hear, my voice is going because I've been talking for, I think, a very long time now. There we go. That has been the final stanzas of Hrafnsmál, and I will put a link in the description of this video to where you can access me reading through stanzas 1 to 11. If you want me to teach you, I can't teach you Old Norse because I don't think I'm like ready to teach that yet, but Old English or Latin or Gothic, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video. You can also join my Discord server where I tend to offer, I can help you out maybe if you ask a question. And for Latin in particular, if I'm not around to help you out with a question, then we have very knowledgeable people who can help you out. And it's also a fun community with like people who are interested in medieval languages, so you should come in and join us. Until next time, all of the usual stuff, please like the video, comment, subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye everyone!